The morning Thomas Harwell found the egg, frost still clung to the edges of his irrigation channels. He'd been working the northern 40 hectares of his settlement plot on Verdant 7 for 3 years now, and he thought he'd seen everything the planet had to offer. Crystal formations that sang in the wind, bioluminescent moss that mapped the night, soil so rich it practically grew crops by itself. But this was different. The egg sat in the middle of his cornfield, nestled in a perfect circle of scorched earth. It was roughly the size of a water tank, its surface covered in scales that shifted between deep crimson and burnished gold, depending on how the light struck them. Heat radiated from it in visible waves, making the air shimmer. Thomas stood there for a long moment, pitchfork in hand, trying to process what he was looking at. "Well," he said to no one in particular, "that's new." He'd heard the rumors, of course. Everyone in the outer colonies had. Dragons were one of the Galactic Council's eldest races, ancient and powerful, with territories spanning dozens of systems. They rarely dealt with humans directly. Most considered humanity too young, too brief a flicker in the cosmic timeline to warrant serious attention. The few dragons who'd visited human space had done so with the kind of detached curiosity one might show watching insects build a nest. Thomas circled the egg slowly, keeping a respectful distance from the scorched perimeter. Up close, he could see patterns in the scales, intricate whorls that seemed to shift and rearrange themselves. The heat was intense but not unbearable, like standing near a forge. He reached out carefully, testing the air with his palm. The egg pulsed. It was a subtle thing, a faint rhythmic throb that he felt more than saw. Something alive in there, something waiting. Thomas withdrew his hand and took a step back, mind racing. This wasn't some abandoned artifact or geological curiosity. This was a dragon egg, somehow deposited in the middle of his farm, and that meant trouble was coming whether he wanted it or not. His first instinct was to call the colonial authority, let them deal with it. But Verdant 7 was a frontier world, 4 jumps from the nearest hub. By the time anyone official arrived, who knew what might happen? The egg could hatch, or its parents could show up, or, and this seemed increasingly likely given the morning's trajectory, something even stranger could occur. Thomas made his decision. He went back to his homestead, retrieved every thermal blanket he owned, and carefully arranged them around the egg's perimeter. If something inside was alive and growing, it would need consistent warmth. Then he set up his portable sensor array, the one he normally used for monitoring soil composition, and recalibrated it to track the egg's temperature and any unusual energy signatures. For 2 days, nothing changed. The egg sat there, pulsing steadily, radiating heat. Thomas worked around it, maintaining his crops and keeping watch. He didn't sleep much. At night, the egg glowed faintly, casting strange shadows across the cornfield. On the 3rd day, the ships arrived. Thomas was checking the irrigation system when the sky split open. Not literally. Even out here on the frontier, he knew what a proper jump point looked like. But the effect was dramatic enough to make his chest tighten with instinctive fear. 3 vessels materialized in low orbit, each easily the size of a city block, their hulls gleaming with scales identical to the egg's surface. Dragon ships, he realized. Ancient and vast and utterly beyond anything human engineering could match. The transmission came through on every frequency simultaneously, overriding his comm system with casual ease. The voice that emerged was deep and resonant, layered with harmonics that made Thomas's teeth ache. "Human farmer Thomas Harwell of Verdant 7. You possess something that belongs to the Dragon Council. Prepare for immediate extraction and audience. No pleas, no request. Just a statement of fact, delivered with the absolute certainty of beings who'd been giving orders since before humans discovered fire." Thomas stood in his cornfield, looking up at the ships that could probably vaporize his entire settlement without slowing down, and did something that would have seemed insane to anyone watching. He touched his comm unit and replied, "The egg's fine. It's safe. But I'm not going anywhere until I know what this is about." The silence that followed stretched for exactly 7 seconds. Thomas counted them, his heart hammering against his ribs. Then the voice returned, and there was something new in it. Not quite surprise. Dragons were too old for surprise, but perhaps a faint note of interest. You dare make demands of the council? Not demands, Thomas said, keeping his voice steady. Clarification. Something appeared on my land. I've been protecting it. I think I'm owed an explanation before strange ships start extracting things from my property. Another pause, shorter this time. When the voice spoke again, it carried what might have been the draconic equivalent of amusement. Very well, farmer. You will be granted audience. Do not make us regret this courtesy. The beam that took him was gentler than he expected, a column of golden light that lifted him smoothly from his field and drew him up toward the nearest ship. Thomas had one moment to hope his crops would be okay, and then he was inside. The interior of the dragon ship was nothing like the sleek corridors of human vessels. Everything was larger, grander, built on a scale that made him feel like a child in a cathedral. The walls weren't metal, but something organic, covered in the same shifting scales as the egg. They pulsed with inner light, warm and alive. The air tasted of cinnamon and sulfur. 2 dragons waited for him in what he assumed was some kind of receiving chamber. They were enormous, easily 5 times his height, even in what seemed to be a relaxed posture. Their scales ranged from deep scarlet to molten gold, and their eyes, ancient beyond measure, fixed on him with an intensity that made his instincts scream to run. He stood his ground. "Thomas Harwell," the larger dragon rumbled. Her voice, definitely feminine, though he couldn't say how he knew, carried authority like a physical weight. "I am Elder Soravesh of the Third Clutch. This is Warden Drakmir. You have shown unexpected consideration in caring for the lost egg." Lost? Thomas found his voice. How does a dragon egg end up in a cornfield? Drakmir, slightly smaller but no less imposing, shifted his massive bulk. A storm during transport. Rare. Unfortunate. The egg was shielded during its fall, but it should not have survived the impact intact. Yet you found it whole and maintaining proper temperature. The thermal blankets probably helped, Thomas said, then immediately wondered if that sounded presumptuous. But Soravesh's eyes glinted with something that might have been approval. Indeed, you understood what you had found and took appropriate action. This is... She paused, seeming to search for words. Unusual for a human. Thomas felt a flash of irritation cut through his fear. We're not complete idiots, you know. Just because we haven't been out here as long as you doesn't mean we can't figure things out. The chamber went very, very quiet. Drakmir's scales rippled in what Thomas belatedly recognized as shock. Soravesh tilted her massive head, studying him with renewed focus. "You speak boldly for one so small and fragile," she observed. "Do you not fear us?" "I'm terrified," Thomas admitted. "But fear doesn't change facts. I found something precious, I protected it, and now I'm trying to understand what happens next. Being scared won't make that process any clearer." Soravesh made a sound like distant thunder. Laughter, Thomas realized with amazement. Actual draconic laughter. "The egg you found," she said after a moment, "contains the heir to the Amber Throne, one of the most significant hatchlings in 5 generations. Its loss would have been catastrophic for our people." Thomas felt his knees go weak, but managed to stay upright. "Oh, that's quite important then." "Indeed." Soravesh moved closer, and Thomas had to resist the urge to back away. "Which brings us to the matter at hand. The Dragon Council wishes to reward you for your service. Name your price, human farmer. Gold, territory, advanced technology." It was the kind of offer people dreamed about, the kind of opportunity that could change a life, elevate a nobody from the frontier into genuine wealth and influence. Thomas thought about his farm, his quiet life, the simple satisfaction of growing things under alien stars. "I don't want payment," he heard himself say, "but I would like to know, will the egg be all right? Will it hatch safely?" The silence that followed Thomas's question felt different from the previous pauses. This wasn't shock or calculation. It was something deeper, a fundamental shift in the atmosphere of the chamber that even his limited human senses could detect. The scales along Sorovesh's spine rippled in a pattern Thomas couldn't interpret, and Warden Drakmir made a low sound in his chest that resonated through the floor. "You refuse reward," Sorovesh said slowly, each word deliberate, "to ask about the egg's welfare." "Well, yes," Thomas said, feeling suddenly uncertain. "I've been watching over it for days. I'd like to know it'll be okay." Elder Sorovesh and Warden Drakmir exchanged a look that Thomas couldn't begin to decipher. Then Sorovesh did something completely unexpected. She lowered her massive head until her eyes were almost level with his, close enough that he could feel the heat radiating from her scales and smell the ancient scent of sulfur and stone. "Thomas Harwell," she said, her voice carrying harmonics that made his bones vibrate. "You have done something no human has achieved in the entirety of your species' brief contact with dragonkind. You have demonstrated perfect custodianship. Not for gain, not for recognition, but because you recognize something precious and chose to protect it." "I just used some blankets and a sensor array," Thomas protested, but Sorovesh made that thunder laugh sound again. "Precisely. You used the tools available to you, limited though they are by our standards, and you applied them with care and intelligence. More significantly, you formed attachment. This is not a trait we associate with young races. They typically see only opportunity, not responsibility." Drakmir moved forward, his scales shifting through shades of amber and copper. "The Dragon Council is convening as we speak. They will wish to meet you directly. This is unprecedented. No human has ever been granted audience with the full council." "I'm just a farmer," Thomas said, the reality of the situation beginning to sink in with mounting dread. "I don't know anything about politics or diplomacy. I grow corn and repair irrigation systems." "You protected a dragon heir without knowing what reward it might bring," Sorovesh countered. "You speak plainly even when terrified. You refuse payment, but ask after the egg's welfare. These are not the actions of a simple farmer, Thomas Harwell. These are the actions of someone who understands what truly matters." The ship shuddered, not from distress, but from what Thomas was beginning to recognize as intentional movement. They were descending, he realized, down to the planet's surface, probably to the egg itself. "What happens now?" he asked. "Now," Sorovesh said, rising to her full height. "You meet the council, and you tell them exactly what you told us. Nothing more, nothing less. Dragons respect honesty above almost all virtues. Your forthrightness may be crude by our standards, but it is genuine. That counts for more than you know." The beam deposited Thomas back in his cornfield 20 minutes later, but he wasn't alone. The 3 dragon ships had landed in a triangular formation around his property, their massive forms somehow managing not to crush his crops. The egg sat at the center of it all, still pulsing with inner warmth, still surrounded by his thermal blankets, and arrayed around it, gleaming in Verdant 7's afternoon sun, were the members of the Dragon Council. There were 12 of them, each representing a different clutch, and together they embodied more age, more power, more concentrated authority than Thomas had ever imagined seeing in one place. Their scales ran the full spectrum from deep obsidian to brilliant platinum, and their eyes, hundreds of years of experience distilled into those ancient gazes, all focused on him as he appeared. Thomas had prepared a speech during the descent, something respectful and diplomatic, acknowledging their importance and expressing his honor at the meeting. But standing there in his own cornfield, dirt under his fingernails and sweat staining his work shirt, facing down beings who'd shaped galactic politics before his species learned to write, all his careful words evaporated. "So," he said instead, "is the kid going to be okay or what?" A dragon the color of storm clouds made a sound like grinding boulders. Another, scales gleaming like fresh blood, rose to her full height in what Thomas recognized as aggressive posturing. But before anyone could respond, a third dragon, ancient beyond measure, scales so pale they were almost translucent, made a sound that cut through everything else. "Peace," the ancient one said, voice like wind through canyons. "Let the humans speak. I am Patriarch Orothan, eldest of the council. You are Thomas Harwell, who found and protected the heir of the Amber Throne. Yes, sir. Elder. Your Honor. Thomas fumbled for proper address and gave up. Look, I don't know the protocols here, but something appeared on my land, and it was clearly alive and clearly needed help. I did what anyone decent would do. Now I just want to make sure it's safe. Anyone decent, repeated a dragon, whose scales shifted between green and blue like deep ocean water. Interesting choice of words. Do you believe yourself decent, human? It felt like a trap, but Thomas had learned over the years that honesty was usually the safest path, even when it felt dangerous. I try to be. Don't always succeed, but I try. Figure that's all anyone can do. Patriarch Orothan moved closer to the egg, moving with surprising grace for something so massive. He extended one talon, easily as long as Thomas's forearm, and touched the egg's surface with extraordinary gentleness. The egg pulsed brighter in response, and Thomas could swear he heard a sound from inside, faint but distinct. The hatchling recognizes its guardian, Orothan said, and there was something in his voice that might have been wonder. It has imprinted on your presence, Thomas Harwell. For 3 days, you have been its world, the warmth, the care, the watchful presence. It knows you. Is that bad? Thomas asked, suddenly worried he'd done something terribly wrong. It is extraordinary, said the red-scaled dragon, though her tone suggested she hadn't entirely decided if this was positive or negative. Dragon hatchlings typically imprint on their parents, their clutch kin, never on another species, certainly never on a human. The circumstances are unique, Councillor Peraxis, Sorovesh interjected. She'd moved to stand near Thomas, which he appreciated more than he could express. The egg was alone, separated from clutch during its most vulnerable period. Thomas provided what it needed most, consistent care and protection. The imprinting is logical given the situation. Logical, perhaps, grumbled the storm cloud dragon, but unprecedented. How do we proceed? We cannot leave a dragon heir bonded to a human farmer on a frontier world. Why not? Thomas found himself asking before his brain could catch up with his mouth. All 12 council members turned to look at him, and he forced himself to continue. I mean, the egg's safe here. I've got plenty of space, good temperature control, and apparently it knows me now. Would moving it be better or worse for the hatchling? Patriarch Orothan made that wind-through canyon sound again. Laughter, Thomas realized. He makes a fair point, Council. The air is stable, properly maintained, and has formed attachment. Relocating during this critical imprinting phase could cause distress. You propose we leave our heir with a human? Peraxis demanded. A being with a lifespan shorter than many of our hatchling periods. What happens when he dies in a handful of decades? I'm 37, Thomas said mildly. Got at least another 60 years in me if I'm lucky. Probably more with modern medicine. How long until the egg hatches? 3 months, Sorovesh answered. And another 2 years until the hatchling can safely separate from its primary guardian. Thomas did the math quickly. So you're worried about coverage for a 2.25-year period out of my probable remaining 80 years? I think we're good. The ocean-coloured dragon made a choking sound. He speaks to the council as though negotiating crop prices. Because that's what this is, Thomas shot back, surprised by his own boldness, but committed now. You need someone to watch your heir. I've already been doing it. I'm apparently decent at it, given the imprinting. And I'm willing to continue. What's complicated about that? The Dragon Council fell into what Thomas was beginning to recognize as their equivalent of heated discussion. They didn't shout. Dragons apparently considered raised voices beneath their dignity, but their scales rippled with color shifts that seemed to communicate complex emotions, and the air between them shimmered with heat from their collective presence. Thomas stood in his cornfield, watching beings older than his entire civilization debate his fate, and tried not to think about how surreal this had become. The precedent alone is unacceptable, Peraxis argued, her crimson scales flashing with agitation. Dragons do not place their heirs in the care of lesser species. It undermines our position in the galactic hierarchy. Lesser species? Thomas couldn't quite keep the edge from his voice. With respect, Counselor, I've kept your heir alive and comfortable for 3 days with nothing but farmer's ingenuity and some thermal blankets. How is that lesser? The storm cloud dragon, Councillor Vexrath, Thomas had learned, made a rumbling sound. Bold words, human. But can you understand what you're truly proposing? Dragon hatchlings are not pets or livestock. They're conscious, intelligent beings from the moment of hatching. Caring for one requires knowledge of our biology, our culture, our ancient traditions. Then teach me, Thomas said simply. I can learn. Been learning new things my whole life. How to work different soils, how to adapt earth crops to alien environments, how to repair equipment I'd never seen before coming to Verdant 7. This can't be that different. It is entirely different, Sorovesh said, though her tone was gentler than the others. A dragon hatchling will communicate through harmonics and thermal expression before it learns verbal language. It will require precise temperature regulation, specific dietary needs, cultural education spanning thousands of years of tradition. And beyond the practical concerns, there is the question of worthiness. Dragons choose their guardians carefully. They must be individuals of exceptional character. And yet the heir has chosen, Patriarch Orothan observed quietly. The ancient dragon had been silent during most of the debate, but now his words cut through the arguing like a blade through silk. It has imprinted on Thomas Harwell. This cannot be undone without causing significant psychological harm to the hatchling. The question before us is not whether this arrangement is ideal, but whether we will honor the heir's choice or prioritize our own comfort with tradition. The silence that followed was profound. Thomas watched the council members process this, saw the subtle shifts in their postures, the way their scales dimmed or brightened as they considered Orothan's words. You would bind the council to honor a hatchling's instinctive imprinting, Paraxis asked, but there was less heat in her voice now. Set precedent that could reshape our entire culture. I would honor the wisdom of new life, Orothan replied. Dragon heirs are precious precisely because they carry our future. Perhaps this one sees something we, in our ancient certainty, cannot. Perhaps the future of dragonkind includes bridges to younger races. Or perhaps, and here his gaze fixed on Thomas with uncomfortable intensity, this human is simply worthy in ways we have failed to recognize. Thomas felt his throat go dry. I'm really not that special. I just did what needed doing. Precisely, Orothan said. You saw need and acted, without calculation of reward, without seeking advantage. You asked nothing for yourself, only for the egg's welfare. Do you understand how rare that is, Thomas Harwell? In a galaxy driven by trade agreements and political maneuvering and endless games of advantage, you performed an act of simple custodianship. You cared because something needed caring for. The ocean-colored dragon, Councillor Thalassor, moved closer to the egg, studying it with eyes that held depths Thomas couldn't fathom. The thermal regulation is crude but effective. The monitoring system is primitive but functional. He has used limited resources with maximum efficiency. This speaks to practical intelligence. And the imprinting speaks to character, added a dragon whose scales gleamed like polished bronze. Heirs do not bond with those who would harm them. The hatchling recognizes something in this human that resonates with draconic values. Vexrath made a sound like distant thunder. Very well. Let us assume, for argument's sake, that we accept this arrangement. What then? Do we simply abandon our heir to human care and hope for the best? No, Sorovesh said, and Thomas heard the weight of commitment in her voice. We assign a warden to remain on Verdant 7, to monitor the heir's development, to provide guidance to Thomas in matters of dragon rearing, to serve as liaison between the council and our most unusual guardian. I volunteer, she added, before anyone could suggest an alternative. Paraxis's scales flashed with surprise. You, Elder Sorovesh? You would accept assignment to a frontier world, watching over a human farmer? I would accept responsibility for a situation I helped create, Sorovesh replied calmly. I was transport lead when the storm struck. The egg's displacement falls partially on my clutch. More importantly, I have observed Thomas Harwell's character. He is blunt, yes, ignorant of our ways, certainly, but he is fundamentally decent, and he cares about the heir's welfare above all else. These are qualities I can work with. Thomas found his voice. Just to be clear, you're proposing that an elder dragon move to my farm to help me raise a dragon hatchling? Temporarily, Sorovesh confirmed, until the heir reaches separation age, 2 years approximately. And what does that involve exactly? The raising, I mean. It was Patriarch Orothan who answered. Temperature maintenance. You have already demonstrated competence there. Dietary provision once hatching occurs. We will supply appropriate nutrition. Protection from threats, though this world seems peaceful enough. And most crucially, cultural education. The heir must learn what it means to be dragon, must understand the weight of its bloodline and the responsibilities of its future position. The Amber Throne, Thomas said, remembering. What is that exactly? One of the 6 great seats of dragon authority, Thalassor explained. The heir you've been protecting will one day lead the Amber Clutch, govern 3 systems, and hold voting power on matters affecting trillions of lives. The education we provide shapes not just a dragon, but a future leader of our people. The weight of that settled on Thomas's shoulders like a physical thing. That's a lot of responsibility. Yes, Orothan agreed, which is why the council must be certain. Thomas Harwell, we will ask you questions now. Answer honestly. Deception will be immediately apparent to us, and will end these negotiations instantly. Do you understand? Thomas nodded, his mouth suddenly dry. First question, Piraxis said, her red scales gleaming. Why did you truly protect the egg? What did you hope to gain? Nothing, Thomas said immediately. It was alive and alone and needed help. That was enough. You didn't imagine the gratitude of dragonkind might benefit you. Honestly, I was mostly worried about keeping it warm enough and hoping its parents wouldn't show up and vaporize me for being near it. A ripple of what might have been amusement passed through several council members. Second question, Vexrath rumbled. The heir will hatch with abilities you cannot match. It will be stronger, more intelligent in some ways, capable of flight and fire. It will be, by definition, superior to you. How will you respond to this? Thomas considered that carefully. Same way I respond to the fact that you're all superior to me right now. Acknowledge it, respect it, and figure out how to work with it. I don't need to be the strongest or smartest thing around to be useful. You would not resent the hatchling's advantages. Why would I? I'm not competing with a kid. I'm trying to help raise one. Thalassor leaned forward. Third question, and perhaps the most important. The heir will live for thousands of years. You will live at most another century. How do you reconcile serving as primary guardian for a being whose lifespan so vastly exceeds your own? This was the question Thomas had been dreading, because he'd been thinking about it since learning about the imprinting. I can't give it thousands of years, he admitted quietly, but I can give it a good start. 2 years of stability, safety, and someone who genuinely cares about its welfare. Maybe that's enough. Maybe that's all any parent can really give their kids. A foundation to build on, and the knowledge they were loved. The silence that followed felt different. Thomas looked up to find all 12 council members staring at him with expressions he couldn't quite read. He calls himself parent to the heir, Piraxis said softly, claims that role as though it were simple. Because to him, it is, Orothan replied. This is what I meant about worthiness, Council. Thomas Harwell doesn't see a political opportunity or a burden of responsibility. He sees a child that needs raising, and he has accepted that role without hesitation. Patriarch Orothan moved to the center of the circle, his translucent scales catching the light in ways that made them seem to glow from within. When he spoke, his voice carried a weight that made the air itself feel heavier. The council will vote, he announced. Not on whether Thomas Harwell is qualified by our traditional standards. Clearly he is not. But on whether we will honor the heir's choice and accept this unprecedented arrangement. Councillor Piraxis, your judgment. The Crimson Dragon was silent for a long moment, her scales rippling through shades of red, like dying embers cycling back to flame. "I have opposed this from the start," she said finally, "but I cannot deny what my eyes have shown me. The air is stable, protected, and has bonded. My pride says to reject this human's custodianship. My reason says we may not have a better option. I vote to allow the arrangement, with Elder Sorovesh serving as warden and the council maintaining close oversight." Thomas felt something in his chest unclench slightly. One vote, at least. "Councillor Vexrath," Orothan prompted. The storm-coloured dragon growled low in his throat. "This sets dangerous precedent. But precedent without wisdom is mere stubbornness. The human speaks plainly, acts with care, and accepts responsibility without seeking glory. These are draconic virtues. I vote to allow the arrangement." One by one, the council members cast their votes. Thalassor voted in favour, noting Thomas's resource efficiency. The bronze-scaled councillor, Magistrate Kelvanis, voted yes after a lengthy discourse on the importance of following the heir's instincts. Others followed, some with reservations, some with surprising enthusiasm, but all arriving at the same conclusion. When the last vote was cast, Patriarch Orothan turned his ancient gaze to Thomas. "It is decided. You will serve as primary guardian to the heir of the Amber Throne, with Elder Sorovesh as warden and advisor. The council will maintain regular contact and provide necessary resources. In exchange, you will commit to the heir's welfare and education for no less than 2 years from hatching." "I accept," Thomas said, and was surprised by how steady his voice sounded. "But I have some conditions." The temperature in the clearing dropped several degrees as 12 dragons focused on him with renewed intensity. Sorovesh made a small sound that might have been warning, but Thomas pressed on. "First, my farm stays mine. I'm happy to dedicate resources to raising the heir, but I'm not giving up my land or my livelihood. Second, I get final say on anything that affects the heir's immediate health and safety. You're the cultural experts, but if something seems wrong to me, I want the authority to act without waiting for council approval. Third, once the heir is old enough to make choices, those choices get respected. I'm not raising a kid to be a puppet." The silence that followed was absolute. Even the wind seemed to have stopped, leaving only the faint pulse of the egg to mark the passage of time. Then Patriarch Orothan laughed, a sound like mountains shifting, deep and resonant, and genuinely amused. "You negotiate with the Dragon Council as though we are equals. This is either profound courage or profound foolishness." "It's common sense," Thomas replied. "You're asking me to commit 2 years of my life to raising your heir. I need to know I can do that job properly, which means having the authority and resources to make it work. Those conditions aren't about disrespecting you. They're about making sure I can deliver what I'm promising." Piraxis made a sound like escaping steam. The audacity of this human exceeds all reasonable bounds. "And yet his conditions are logical," Kelvanis observed. "We are asking him to accept enormous responsibility. Is it not reasonable that he should have commensurate authority, at least in matters of daily care?" Vexrath rumbled agreement. The farm must remain his. Removing his livelihood would only create stress that could affect the heir. As for decision-making authority in emergencies, that seems practical. We cannot respond instantly to crises light years away. "And the third condition?" Thalassor asked. "Respecting the heir's choices." "Is draconic tradition," Orothan said firmly. "We already honour the free will of our young, even when their choices displease us. Thomas asks only that we continue our own practices. I see no conflict." The vote on Thomas's conditions was quicker than the first, and unanimous. As each councillor agreed, Thomas felt the reality of what he'd just committed to settling onto his shoulders like a weight. 2 years, raising a dragon, teaching it to navigate a universe he barely understood himself. "Excellent," Orothan said. "Then we have accord. Elder Sorovesh, you will establish residence here and begin preparing for the hatching. The council will arrange supply shipments, nutrition supplements, cultural archives, communication equipment. Thomas Harwell, you will receive compensation for your service." "Don't want payment," Thomas interrupted. "I said that already." "And we heard you," Orothan replied patiently. However, raising an heir will require resources beyond what a frontier farm can provide. You will accept technological upgrades to your homestead, educational materials, and a stipend to offset any income lost to caregiving responsibilities. This is not payment, it is practical support. Do you dispute the logic? Thomas opened his mouth to argue, then closed it. That's actually fair. Okay, I accept the support. Wisdom, Orothan said, with what might have been approval. Now, there is one final matter to address before we depart. The naming. The egg already has a name, doesn't it? Thomas asked. I mean, it's the heir of the Amber Throne. That is a title, Sorovesh explained. Dragons receive their true names at hatching, based on the circumstances of their birth and the qualities they demonstrate in their first moments of life. Traditionally, the parent names the hatchling. In this case, as guardian, that honor falls to you. Thomas stared at her. You want me to name a dragon? We want you to name our heir, Piraxis corrected. When it hatches, you will observe its nature, its spirit, and you will give it a name that captures its essence. This is not a light responsibility, human. A dragon's true name shapes its identity and carries power. Choose poorly, and you may doom the heir to a life poorly suited to its nature. No pressure then, Thomas muttered, but his mind was already racing. A name. He'd named his dog, years ago, and his favorite tractor. But this was different. This mattered in ways he was only beginning to comprehend. You will know the right name when the moment comes, Orothan said, moving toward his ship. Trust your instincts. They have served you well thus far. The council will return in 3 months for the hatching. Until then, Elder Sorovesh will guide you in preparation. One by one, the great dragons departed, their ships rising into Verdant Seven's sky with surprising grace. Soon, only Sorovesh remained, her golden crimson bulk standing beside Thomas's modest homestead, like a living monument. So, Thomas said, after the last ship had vanished into the upper atmosphere, where exactly are you planning to sleep? Because my barn definitely isn't big enough. Sorovesh made that thunder laugh sound again. Dragons do not require enclosed shelter, Thomas Harwell. I will rest near the egg. It will need constant monitoring as hatching approaches, but I appreciate your concern for my comfort. Right. Okay. And you said there are preparations we need to make? Many, Sorovesh confirmed. The egg will require increasingly precise temperature regulation as the hatchling develops. We'll need to construct a proper hatching ground, cleared space with temperature controls and protective barriers. The hatchling will be hungry immediately upon emergence and will need specific nutrients, and you will need education in dragon physiology, behavior, and cultural basics. Thomas looked at his quiet farm, at the cornfield and irrigation channels, and modest homestead he'd built with his own hands over 3 years of hard work. In 3 months, a dragon was going to hatch here, an heir to an ancient throne, with a lifespan measured in millennia and abilities he could barely imagine. And somehow, impossibly, he was supposed to help raise it. Okay, he said, taking a deep breath. Where do we start? Sorovesh settled her massive form more comfortably, careful not to crush any crops. We start with understanding. I will teach you about dragons, our biology, our culture, our values. You will teach me about humans, and more specifically about yourself. If we are to successfully co-parent the heir, we must understand each other. Co-parent, Thomas repeated. That's really what this is, isn't it? Yes, Sorovesh said simply. I will provide cultural knowledge and physiological expertise. You will provide something else. Something the heir apparently recognized even before hatching. I confess, I do not fully understand what you offer, Thomas Harwell. But the heir chose you, and dragons trust the wisdom of new life. So I will learn to understand. They sat there as Verdant Seven's sun began to set, human and dragon beside an egg that pulsed with warmth and promise. Thomas thought about his quiet life, about the peace he'd found growing crops on a frontier world far from Earth's complexities. That peace was gone now, replaced by something far more complicated and infinitely more important. First lesson, Sorovesh said as darkness fell. Dragon hatchlings can sense emotion through thermal signatures. Your fear, your determination, your care. The air feels all of it, even now. What you are inside matters more than what you say or do. Dragons value authenticity above almost everything else. So when I said I was terrified earlier, the air already knew, and it knew your fear did not stop you from acting to protect it. That is what created the bond, Thomas. Not fearlessness, but courage, despite fear. The air recognized a kindred spirit. Dragons feel fear too, though we rarely admit it. Thomas absorbed that, watching the egg's steady pulse. What are dragons afraid of? Irrelevance, Sorovesh said quietly. We are an ancient race in a galaxy that grows younger and faster every cycle. We fear becoming obsolete, watching the universe move past us while we cling to tradition. The air you protect represents our future, our hope that dragonkind can adapt and endure. Perhaps that is why it chose a human guardian. It needs to learn from the new as well as the old. That's a lot of weight for a kid to carry. Yes, which is why it will need you. To teach it that being ancient and powerful is not the only way to matter. That simple decency and honest effort have value. That sometimes the most important thing is to just care for what's in front of you and trust that's enough. Thomas thought about that as the stars began to emerge above them. Alien constellations he'd learned to navigate by, but still didn't entirely recognize as home. 3 months until hatching, 2 years of guardianship. And then what? The heir would move on to its destiny, and he'd return to farming, his life briefly intersecting with something vast and strange before diverging again. But for now, in this moment, his job was simple. Keep the egg warm, learn what he needed to learn, and prepare to welcome new life into the universe. He could do that. It was just farming, really. Careful tending, patient waiting, trusting that with the right conditions, something precious would grow. Second lesson, Sorovesh said, interrupting his thoughts. Tomorrow, we begin construction of the hatching ground. It will require significant modification to your property. Are you certain you're prepared for this, Thomas? There is still time to reconsider. Thomas looked at the egg, at the steady pulse of life within it, and thought about the moment he'd found it sitting in his cornfield, like the universe's strangest gift. I'm prepared, he said. Let's get to work. The next 3 months transformed Thomas's farm in ways he never could have imagined. What started as a simple cornfield became something between a nursery and a monument. With technology, Thomas couldn't begin to understand integrated seamlessly with his own modest equipment. Sorovesh proved to be an exacting but patient teacher. She spent the first week simply observing how Thomas worked, his routines, his problem-solving approaches, his relationship with the land. Then she began suggesting modifications, always framed as questions rather than commands. Your irrigation system is efficient for crops, she noted one morning, but could it be adapted to create temperature gradients around the hatching ground? The air will need zones of different warmth for comfort. Thomas studied the existing pipes, mentally mapping the flow patterns. Maybe. I'd need to add some bypass valves and install heating elements. Could use solar collectors to power them. We get plenty of sun here. Show me, Sorovesh said, and Thomas found himself explaining his farming infrastructure to an ancient dragon, pointing out the clever solutions he'd developed for working with Verdant 7's unique environment. To his surprise, Sorovesh listened with genuine interest, occasionally asking questions that made Thomas reconsider his own systems with fresh eyes. The hatching ground itself took shape slowly but steadily. Thomas cleared a circular area about 30 meters across, removing the corn but carefully transplanting what he could to other fields. The soil underneath was rich and dark, and Sorovesh had him mix in special compounds shipped from dragon worlds, minerals that would help regulate temperature and provide trace nutrients if the hatchling chose to burrow. Dragons don't always stay above ground immediately after hatching, she explained, as Thomas worked the strange, shimmering powder into the earth. Some prefer to dig, to feel the weight of soil above them. It's instinctive, reaching back to when our ancestors emerged from volcanic caverns. So I might lose sight of the kid right after birth? Thomas asked, trying not to sound anxious about that. Briefly, perhaps, but the imprinting will hold. The heir will surface when it wishes to engage with you. Dragon young need time to process existence. Hatching is traumatic, overwhelming. A brief period of solitude underground helps them center themselves. Thomas thought about that as he worked, trying to imagine consciousness suddenly awakening inside a shell, the shock of air and light and sensation after months of warm darkness. Must be scary, he said, coming into the world like that. Yes, Sorovesh agreed, which is why the Guardian's presence matters so much. Knowing there is someone above, someone waiting with care rather than threat, it makes the transition bearable. They installed temperature controls around the perimeter, sophisticated systems that could maintain different zones, ranging from pleasantly warm to intensely hot. Thomas insisted on backup systems for everything, triple redundancy that made Sorovesh's scales ripple with amusement. You trust nothing to chance, she observed. Can't afford to, Thomas replied, checking calibration on a thermal sensor. Out here, equipment failure means crop loss or worse. You learn to prepare for everything breaking at the worst possible moment. A wise philosophy. Very draconic, actually. We too prefer multiple contingencies. The egg itself grew more active as time passed. The pulse Thomas had first noticed became more pronounced, more rhythmic. Sometimes he could see movement beneath the scaled surface, bulges that appeared and vanished as the hatchling shifted inside. Sorovesh taught him to read these signs. Certain patterns meant healthy development, while others might indicate distress. The air is strong, she said after one such examination. Development proceeds perfectly. You should feel proud, Thomas. Your care has given it an ideal environment for growth. Thomas felt warmth in his chest at that, a pride he hadn't expected. He'd raised crops before, tended animals in his youth back on Earth. But this felt different, more personal somehow. Maybe it was the imprinting, the knowledge that something inside that egg knew him, recognized him as safe and important. The educational component of his preparation proved more challenging than the physical work. Sorovesh brought him archives, holographic displays that showed dragon history stretching back thousands of years, cultural practices refined over generations, biological information about hatchling development that made Thomas's head spin. I can't learn all this in 3 months, he protested, after a particularly dense session on draconic political structures. You don't need to learn everything, Sorovesh assured him. You need to understand the basics, enough to answer the heir's first questions, enough to provide context for its existence. The deep knowledge will come later, as the heir grows. Your role initially is simply to be present, stable, and engaged. What kind of questions do hatchlings ask? The fundamental ones. Why do I exist? What am I? Where do I belong? Your answers don't need to be comprehensive. They need to be honest. Dragons value truth above complexity. Thomas thought about that during his evening routines, as he checked the egg's temperature and made sure all systems were functioning properly. What would he say if a newborn dragon asked him why it existed? How did you explain purpose to something that would live for thousands of years? You tell them they're here because the universe made space for them, Sorovesh said when he posed the question. That their existence has meaning simply by virtue of being. Dragons don't believe in predetermined purpose. We believe consciousness itself is purpose enough. That's actually beautiful, Thomas said, surprised. We are an old race, but not an unthinking one. Philosophy matters to us. The heir will need to develop its own understanding of existence. Your job is to provide the foundation for that exploration. Nights on the farm took on a new rhythm. Thomas would finish his work, grab dinner, and then sit beside the egg with Sorovesh, talking about everything and nothing. He told her about Earth, about humanity's chaotic expansion into space, about the small town where he'd grown up, and the series of choices that had led him to Verdant 7. In turn, she shared dragon stories, epic tales of ancient conflicts and quiet moments of beauty, the kind of layered history that could only come from a species that measured time in millennia. Your people are so young, she said one night, not critically, but with something like wonder. Everything happening so fast, changing so rapidly. It must be exhausting. Sometimes, Thomas admitted. But it's also exciting. We're still figuring out who we are, what we want to be. Every generation gets to reinvent humanity a little bit. Dragons don't have that luxury. We are what we have always been. There is comfort in that, but also constraint. Maybe that's why the heir chose me, Thomas suggested. To see what happens when someone isn't constrained by thousands of years of tradition. Get a fresh perspective on things. Soravesh's scales rippled in a pattern Thomas had learned to recognize as thoughtfulness. Perhaps, or perhaps it simply recognized kindness and chose to trust it. Not everything requires complex explanation, Thomas. Sometimes, beings choose each other for the simplest reasons. 2 weeks before the projected hatching date, the Dragon Council returned for inspection. Thomas had been dreading it, expecting criticism and demands for changes. Instead, Patriarch Orothan walked the hatching ground with what seemed like approval, examining the temperature systems and soil composition with careful attention. "You have done well," the ancient dragon announced. "This space honors both the heir's needs and the land itself. I see the care in every detail." "Elder Soravesh did most of the technical work," Thomas said, but Orothan made a dismissive sound. "Soravesh provided knowledge. You provided implementation and adaptation. Do not diminish your contribution, Guardian. The heir will emerge into a space that is both properly draconic and uniquely suited to this world. That synthesis comes from you." Councillor Pyraxis circled the egg, her red scales gleaming in the afternoon sun. "The development is optimal. Hatching should occur within the projected window. Have you prepared mentally, Thomas Harwell? The moment of emergence can be intense." "I've birthed calves and helped with difficult foalings," Thomas said. "I know birth can be messy and scary. I'm ready." "Dragon hatching is different," Pyraxis warned. "The heir will emerge with fire and fury, instinctively defensive. You must remain calm, show no fear, let it scent your care beneath the chaos. I'll manage. See that you do, for all our sakes." After the council departed again, Thomas found himself alone with the egg during one of Soravesh's brief absences. She'd gone to receive a supply shipment from orbit, leaving him as sole guardian for the first time since her arrival. The responsibility felt heavier without her presence, the weight of everything resting on his shoulders. He sat beside the egg, feeling its warmth, watching the increasingly frequent movements beneath the surface. "Hey kid," he said softly, feeling only mildly foolish talking to an unhatched dragon. "I don't know if you can hear me, or if you'll even remember this once you're out. But I want you to know, I'm here. Whatever happens, however scary or confusing things get, you've got someone waiting who cares about you. Not because of what you'll become or what title you'll hold, just because you're you and you matter." The egg pulsed brighter, warmer, and Thomas could have sworn he felt something like recognition in that heat. Maybe it was imagination, or maybe Soravesh was right about thermal communication. Either way, he felt connected to the life growing inside that scaled shell, bound by something deeper than duty or agreement. "We're going to figure this out together," he promised. "You teach me about being dragon, I'll teach you about being, well, whatever you want to be. Deal?" The egg pulsed again, steady and strong, and Thomas took that as agreement. 2 weeks to go until the world changed forever. 2 weeks until his quiet farm became birthplace to a dragon heir. He should have been terrified, probably was, somewhere under the layers of determination and stubborn care. But mostly, Thomas felt something else entirely: anticipation, purpose, the knowledge that he was exactly where he needed to be, doing exactly what he was meant to do. It was a feeling he'd rarely experienced in life, that sense of rightness beyond doubt or question. When Soravesh returned an hour later, she found him still sitting beside the egg, one hand resting on its warm surface. "All well?" she asked. "All well," Thomas confirmed. "I think the kid knows we're ready for it." "Good," Soravesh said, settling beside him with surprising gentleness for something so massive. Because ready or not, it's coming soon. I can sense the changes accelerating. Perhaps only days now, not weeks. Thomas's heart rate picked up, but he kept his voice steady. Then I guess we'd better make sure everything's perfect. Everything is already perfect, Thomas. You need to trust that. The heir chose well, both in you and in Sorovesh as co-guardians. Now we simply wait and prepare to welcome new life. Simple, Thomas thought. Nothing about this was simple. But maybe that was okay. Maybe the best things never were. The hatching began on a Tuesday, which Thomas later reflected seemed absurdly mundane for an event that would reshape his entire understanding of life and responsibility. He'd been checking the moisture levels in the eastern cornfield when Sorovesh's roar split the morning air. Not aggressive, but urgent. A clarion call that sent him sprinting back toward the hatching ground. By the time he arrived, breathless and heart-hammering, the egg was already showing cracks. They weren't the delicate fractures he'd expected from bird eggs back on Earth. These were massive fissures that glowed from within, pulsing with heat so intense the air above them shimmered and warped. As Thomas watched, another crack appeared, accompanied by a sound like breaking stone and a gout of flame that shot 3 meters into the air. "Is that normal?" he gasped, sheltering behind Sorovesh's bulk from the heat. "Perfectly normal," she assured him, though her scales were rippling with patterns Thomas had learned meant high emotional state. "Dragon young burn through their shells. Stand ready. Emergence is imminent." The egg trembled, bulged, and then exploded. There was no other word for it. The shell didn't crack open gently. It detonated in a shower of scaled fragments and white-hot flame, revealing the creature within. Thomas's first coherent thought was that the hatchling was simultaneously exactly what he'd expected, and nothing like it. It was small, barely the size of a large dog, but perfect in every detail. Its scales shifted between amber and gold, catching the light with an iridescence that made it seem to glow from within. Its wings were folded tight against its body, membranes translucent in the morning sun. And its eyes, when they opened and fixed on Thomas with laser focus, held an intelligence that was utterly alien and completely unmistakable. The hatchling took one experimental breath, and fire emerged. Not the roaring inferno from before, but a thin stream of pure white flame that carved a line in the soil. Then it made a sound, a chirping roar that somehow managed to be both adorable and terrifying. "Thomas," Sorovesh said quietly, urgently, "approach slowly. Let it scent you. Remember, no fear." Thomas moved forward, hands open and empty, trying to project every ounce of calm and care he'd been cultivating for 3 months. The hatchling watched him with those impossibly intelligent eyes, head tilted in assessment. When he was close enough to touch, it leaned forward and sniffed, nostrils flaring as it processed his scent. Then, deliberately, it pressed its scaled head against his palm. The relief Thomas felt was so intense, his knees nearly buckled. The hatchling recognized him, accepted him, confirmed the bond that had been forming since that first moment in the cornfield. He let his hand rest on the warm scales, feeling the power coiled in that small body, the life force that burned hotter than any furnace. "Hey, kid," he whispered. "Welcome to the universe." The hatchling made that chirping roar again, then did something unexpected. It climbed him, literally scaled his body like a tree, claws finding purchase on his clothes with surprising gentleness, until it perched on his shoulder and wrapped its tail around his neck for balance. From this vantage point, it surveyed the hatching ground with what Thomas would swear was satisfaction. "It has claimed you," Sorovesh said, and there was something in her voice that might have been awe. "Completely and without reservation. You are its primary guardian, its first pillar of security in this world. This is... Thomas, this is extraordinary. Most hatchlings remain with their biological parents for weeks before accepting others. Your heir has accepted you within minutes." "Because it already knew me," Thomas said, understanding settling over him like dawn. All those weeks of care, of presence. It wasn't a stranger who greeted it. It was home. The hatchling chirped agreement, nuzzling against his ear with affection that was unmistakable even across species lines. Over the next hours, Thomas learned the reality of caring for a newborn dragon. The hatchling was curious about everything, investigating the hatching ground with tireless energy. It would examine an interesting rock for several minutes, turning it over with delicate talons, then forget it completely and investigate a patch of different-colored soil with equal intensity. Everything was new. Everything deserved attention. It was also hungry, ravenously so. Soravesh had prepared nutrient supplements, specially formulated mineral compounds that dragons needed in their first weeks of life. The hatchling attacked these with enthusiasm, making small, satisfied sounds as it crunched through materials that looked like crystallized gemstones to Thomas's eyes. The minerals support scale development and fire gland maturation, Soravesh explained as they watched the hatchling eat. For the first month, it will need 3 feedings daily. After that, we can reduce to twice daily. And the fire? Thomas asked, remembering the spectacular display during hatching. Is that dangerous? Not to you. The air would never deliberately harm its guardian. But you should be cautious near flammable materials. The young have imperfect control. It may sneeze flame or express emotion through small bursts. This is normal and will regulate with time and training. As if to demonstrate, the hatchling finished its meal and let out a satisfied belch, accompanied by a puff of smoke that made Thomas cough and Soravesh make that thunder laugh sound. Yes, she said with clear amusement. Exactly like that. The Dragon Council arrived that evening, descending from the sky with ceremony and gravitas. Thomas stood in the hatching ground, the hatchling still perched on his shoulder like the universe's strangest parrot, and watched 12 ancient dragons land around them. The hatching was successful, Patriarch Orothan observed, and the heir has bonded immediately with its guardian. This is auspicious, Thomas Harwell. You have fulfilled the first and most crucial stage of your responsibility. The hard part's just starting though, right? Thomas said, reaching up to steady the hatchling as it shifted position. Indeed. Now comes education, guidance, the slow work of helping a young mind understand itself and its place in existence. This will require patience beyond what you may imagine. I'm a farmer, Thomas reminded him. Patience is kind of the job description. Councillor Pyraxis approached, her eyes fixed on the hatchling with an intensity that made Thomas instinctively protective. It is strong, she said. Beautiful. The lineage is clear in its scales and stance. But has it shown signs of intelligence, of the consciousness we expect from heirs? As if answering the challenge, the hatchling launched itself from Thomas's shoulder and glided, on wings it shouldn't yet have the strength to use, directly to Pyraxis. It landed on her massive snout and made a series of chirps that somehow managed to sound imperious. It says hello, Soravesh translated, scales rippling with barely suppressed amusement. And it asks why you question its intelligence when it can clearly understand you perfectly well. Pyraxis's eyes widened fractionally. It comprehends draconic speech already. Apparently so. I told you. This air is exceptional. The hatchling chirped again, longer this time, and Soravesh's amusement deepened. Now it asks if you're always this grumpy, or if it's a special occasion. Several council members made sounds of surprise. Thomas felt a surge of pride and slight concern at his charge's boldness. The heir has spirit, Orothan said, and his tone suggested approval. This is good. The Amber Throne requires strength of personality as well as wisdom. Now, Thomas Harwell, comes the naming. You have observed the hatchling's nature. What name captures its essence? Thomas had been thinking about this for 3 months, considering hundreds of possible names, from traditional dragon appellations to human names to completely invented options. But now, watching the hatchling fearlessly interact with beings thousands of times its age, seeing the way it had immediately claimed its space in the world with confidence and curiosity, only one name felt right. Kestros, he said. It means bright courage in Old Earth Greek. This kid came out of the egg literally on fire, immediately investigated everything in sight, and just told a council member they're grumpy. That's bright courage if I've ever seen it. The hatchling, Kestros chirped enthusiastically and launched back to Thomas, resuming its shoulder perch with obvious satisfaction. The Dragon Council was silent for a moment, processing the name. Kestros, Patriarch Orothan repeated, testing the syllables. A human word for a dragon heir. This too is unprecedented, but... He paused, looking at the hatchling with something like fondness. It fits. The name captures the spirit we see before us. The council accepts this naming. One by one, the other councillors voiced agreement. Even Peraxis, despite her earlier skepticism, inclined her massive head in acknowledgement. Then it is official, Orothan declared. Kestros, heir of the Amber Throne, born on Verdant 7, under the guardianship of Thomas Harwell and Elder Soravesh. Let this day be recorded in the histories of dragonkind. As the council prepared to depart, Orothan approached Thomas one final time. You have done well, Guardian. Better than we could have hoped. But remember, this is only the beginning. Kestros will grow in power and intelligence rapidly. The coming months will test you in ways you cannot yet imagine. Do not hesitate to call upon us if you need assistance. I won't, Thomas promised. But I think we've got a pretty good team here. Me, Soravesh, and Kestros. We'll figure it out. Of that, Orothan said, I have no doubt. After the council left, Thomas sat in the hatching ground with Kestros curled in his lap, finally showing signs of exhaustion from the day's excitement. Soravesh settled nearby, her massive presence somehow comforting rather than overwhelming. You did well today, she said quietly. The naming especially. Kestros is perfect. Human-dragon synthesis, just like this entire arrangement. Think the other dragons will accept an heir with a human name? They'll accept Kestros, Soravesh replied firmly. The heir has already demonstrated the personality to ensure that. And besides, you've proven that humans and dragons can work together successfully. This hatching, this partnership, it changes things, Thomas. Not just for Kestros, but for the relationship between our species. Thomas looked down at the sleeping hatchling, at the gentle rise and fall of scaled breath, the occasional puff of smoke from dreaming nostrils. I just wanted to keep the egg warm, he said. I wasn't trying to change anything. The best changes often begin that way. Small acts of care, multiplied across time and circumstance. You protected what needed protecting. Everything else followed from that simple choice. Kestros stirred, made a small chirp of contentment, and burrowed closer to Thomas's warmth. In that moment, farmer and dragon and ancient elder, Thomas felt something settle in his chest. This was his life now, not the quiet solitude he'd sought on Verdant 7, but something richer and stranger and infinitely more important. 2 years of guardianship stretched ahead, full of challenges and discoveries, and moments he couldn't yet predict. But right now, in this moment, everything was exactly as it should be. An egg had appeared in his cornfield, and he'd done what any decent being would do. He'd protected it, cared for it, given it the best chance he could. That the universe had rewarded that simple decency with a dragon heir and a place in galactic history was almost beside the point. The real reward was sleeping in his arms, trusting and safe and alive. So, Thomas said to Soravesh, what happens tomorrow? Tomorrow, she replied, we begin teaching Kestros about the universe, about dragons and humans and the infinite possibilities between, about responsibility and joy and the weight of ancient bloodlines, about how sometimes the most important thing is to just care for what's in front of you and trust that's enough. Sounds like a pretty good lesson plan. It's worked well so far. They sat there as Verdant 7's sun set, human and elder dragon and sleeping hatchling, and Thomas thought about the strange paths life could take. 3 months ago, he'd been a simple farmer. Now he was guardian to the heir of the Amber Throne, partner to an ancient dragon, and somehow, impossibly, exactly where he needed to be. Kestros chirped in sleep, probably dreaming of flight or fire, or the vast universe waiting to be explored. Thomas smiled and settled in for a long night of guardian duty. After all, he had a kid to raise.